to go to college. She lives with her aunt, and she has a mother that wishes she has never been born. So Ruby has a lot of family issues, but there is this scholarship that's looming. There's a program in Philadelphia where she lives that promises that if she works hard, she could be the first in her family to go to college on a full scholarship. But she finds this uncanny love. She falls in love with a Jewish boy. His name is Shimmy. And this relationship is taboo on every level of taboo. And it threatens to upend everything that Ruby has been working for. And then we have Eleanor, who is just a gal from Ohio. She moves to Howard University, which is in Washington, D.C., and she falls in love with the handsome William Pride. And William Pride is on track to become a doctor. His father is a doctor. He comes from a long line of African-American doctors in their community. But the one thing about this community is that they don't just let anybody into their fold. And so Eleanor has a tricky time trying to fit in with his family and his circle and his influence. And she has to go to great lengths to try to make things work. The story goes back and forth between both characters, and there's this thing at the center of the story that brings them together. I think it's an epic love story. I've been told that it's a page turner. People can't seem to go to bed once they start. You know, once you get a couple of chapters in, you just gobble up the pages and want to know what's happening next.
That's the way I read it. I didn't read it in one sitting, but I just couldn't put it down. So I've seen other interviews that you've done, and I think the audience would be very interested in knowing what inspired you to write this book.
Well, Yellow Wife was my fourth novel, and it was my first historical novel. And that book happened by accident. It wasn't anything that I had planned to do. I just happened to be on the Richmond Slave Trail in Richmond, and I felt like the ancestors, the spirits just start speaking to me. And they insisted that I write that book. And so I did. And it went out into the world, and it did phenomenally. And I was sort of caught in that place of, I was pretty clear that Yellow Wife was the best novel that I had to offer the world. And the question that kept plaguing me was, how do you better your best, right? How do you better your best? And that was a little bit scary. So I started to shy away from, maybe I'm not going to write historical fiction again. But I started thinking about things that my grandmother told me. My grandmother said that she had been the black sheep of our family, that she got pregnant with my mom at age 14. She gave birth to her at 15. This was the 1950s in Philadelphia. And as we know, good girls just didn't do that. That was not the way things were done during that time period. And so there was a lot of shame and secrecy surrounding the birth of my mother. My mother told me that she didn't know my grandmother was her actual mother until she was in the third grade. Up until that point, she had lived with her own grandmother, and it had never been openly discussed. And it got me to thinking about women, you know, during this time period, the sacrifices and the shame and the secrecy. And, you know, what options did my grandmother have, you know, as a Black woman in Philadelphia, when she found herself pregnant and in trouble? What options were out there for her? And that question led me to the library. I don't know if there's any librarians on with us, but the library is like one of my sacred favorite places in the world. And being in the library, I discovered a book called The Girls Who Went Away by Ann Fessler. And the book told the story of 100 girls who went into maternity homes and what their lives were like, what their struggles were like. And I thought, this is what I want to write about, because maternity homes was not something that I learned about in social studies, right? It's a part of our women's history, is our American history. But as we know, they like to sort of blot and leave stories out, specifically when there's things that have to do with women and women's rights. And so it became a near and dear story for me, and something that I wanted to sort of expose and open up. I see my writing as a balm for people. And so that if you had lived this experience, you're not alone. When you read my story, you feel heard, you feel seen, and you feel a part of.
So a natural extension of of this discussion, Sadiqa, is the question of whether your grandmother lived to see you write this book and pay tribute to her, really.
She did not actually. My grandmother had passed on prior to me even deciding that this was going to be my next book, which I think made it a little bit easier to tell the story. But I also, again, feel like the ancestors are always smiling on me and whispering in my ear and giving me their stories so that I could sort of be their conduit. The stories flow through me and that I could write them. So I know that she's blessed the story. There's no other way to describe the fact that it's my first New York Times bestseller, that it was a Reese Witherspoon pick, that I've been nominated for an NAACP Image Award, and the list goes on. There's no other way to describe or make sense of it other than she's up there blessing it.
Wow. So let's talk about when you found out that you were a Reese Witherspoon Book of the Month pick. Talk about how you found out about that.
Well, it's funny because it's sort of a long process. I remember my editor coming to me probably in May or so and saying, could you get this next draft off pretty quickly? Because we want to send it to some of the celebrity book clubs. And so it was like, okay, let me crank out this next draft, get it over to her, sort of forget about it, move on with my life. And I got a call from her, my editor, probably late September or early October, and asked if I could just jump on a quick Zoom really quick. And so when I'm home, I'm writing, t-shirt, crazy hair, all of that, pencil behind my ear. And I thought I should probably fix myself up a little bit. And then I go, well, no, let me just see what she wants. So I jump on the Zoom call, and it's my editor, it's some other people from sales and marketing and my agents, and then people who I don't know. And she says, "You have been, the House of Eve has been selected for the Reese Witherspoon pick. The only caveat is that they want to move the book to February. At that point, the book was coming out in March. So if you're okay with moving it to February, the Reese Witherspoon pick." And I was thinking, Reese can publish the book tomorrow if that's what she wants. And so that was it. You have to keep the secret. You can't tell anyone. And you just sit, you sort of forget about it and go back to what you were doing until it's announced.
Wow, that's like winning an Oscar and then not being able to tell anyone, you know?
Exactly.
And what shape was the book in at that point?
I mean, it was in pretty good shape. I do a lot of drafts between my agent and my editor. It wasn't the final copy that they had. We still probably did another tightening things up draft and then sort of the copy editing, proofreading part of it. But it wasn't in its final form when they decided to select the book. So I don't know what they're reading for. They're probably reading for story and less grammar. I think that's
Yeah,
probably what it is.
yeah. So I want to say the Washington Post said that House of Ease was engrossing, emotionally wrenching, and a socially astute storytelling. And it became, as you said, it became a New York Times bestseller. So what a great review from the Washington Post. That must have thrilled
Mm.
you too.
Oh my goodness. I mean, any review is a good review, but when you get a big newspaper like the Washington Post, it really sets things in motion.
Yes. And so House of Eve is so highly recommended for a number of reasons, and we're going to talk about those reasons. But one of them is because you had really rich characters. And you mentioned earlier that the two protagonists are Eleanor and Ruby.
Mm.
And were those modeled over, like Ruby was kind of modeled over your grandmother, but was Eleanor modeled over anyone you knew? Or where did her character come from?
Sure. Well, Ruby came first before the idea of the House of Eve came, if that makes sense. So I was thinking prior to writing the House of Eve that I was going to write YA novels. And so I had organize three different stories. And Ruby happened to be one of the characters in one of those stories. So I knew that she was 15. I knew that she had a body shaped like a Coca-Cola bottle, right? Like that old Coca-Cola bottle, very shapely, very endowed. I knew that when she walked through the streets of North Philadelphia, grown men catcalled her on the street. And so that she was in sexual danger. And I knew that she had a mom that wished she had never been born. And then I sort of tied that into what my grandmother told me and started to kind of make Ruby's story. But Eleanor came to me a lot differently because I actually thought the story was going to be Ruby and Ruby's alone. But I was sitting in my office one day, sort of looking out the window, trying to figure out what to write next. And I felt this presence come over me. And it was strong, it was aggressive, it was desperate, it was angry, it was Eleanor. And she said, I need to have a baby. And I thought, okay, not sure where you came from. Hang on a second. Don't go anywhere, but I'm not quite sure what to do with you because I didn't want her to take over the story. Sometimes a character will come to you and they try and wreak havoc and take over the story. But I remember that weekend watching Toni Morrison. She did a documentary called The Pieces I Am. And in the documentary, Toni Morrison said that she had grown up in Ohio. And when she went down to Washington, D.C., she also went to Howard University, which, for those who don't know, Howard University is a historical Black college and university in D.C., one of the oldest in the country. She said she didn't know that Black folks separated themselves by skin color until she stepped foot on Howard University's campus. She said in Ohio, where she grew up, Black folks were so busy getting along with everyone. She lived with Italians and Irish and Poles that they didn't have time to sort of pit themselves against each other. And I thought, wow, that's so interesting. Well, what if Eleanor went down to Howard? She meets this eligible bachelor, but he comes from one of those families. How would that shake things up? And then she has this secret, that's kind of in between them. And so that was how Eleanor got into the story. And I decided to write Ruby Eleanor, Ruby Eleanor. So you went back and forth between the two every other chapter. But it's sort of like two separate stories that come together somewhere in the middle, and you see where the connection between the two characters are.
Yeah, and that's a very popular technique in current fiction today, is to have two or three characters with book chapters and you're trying to figure out what the connection is. Isn't that a more recent literary phenomenon that people write books like that?
People have books, a lot of books where people have done that. I really think it depends on the type of story you're trying to tell. So for me, when I was telling Yellow Wife, I knew that my main character, you needed to be in her world. You needed to be walking through Yellow Wife as if you were right next to Phoebe in order to feel what she was feeling and go through what she was going through. So I knew that book was singular, one person, first person, and that you were with her. But with this story, when I tried to tell it just through Ruby's eyes, it felt like so much was being left out and that it was going to be harder to tell. So I sort of needed Eleanor to complete the story. So it depends on the way you're trying to tell a story and what story you're trying to tell.
Yes, but I think that's interesting, and I think it grabs people because you're trying to figure it out all along. What those characters are going to have in common and when they're going to meet up and what their relationship is going to be. So I think it's an effective literary technique. I like books like that.
I'm glad to hear that.
So let's talk about motherhood for a minute, because Ruby has a mother who wants nothing to do with her. And Eleanor ends up with, let's just say, a very challenging mother-in-law. And so, you've said before that you like to write a lot about mothers and even about the full spectrum of motherhood, from the perfect idyllic mother, the Leave It to Beaver mom, and the challenging mom. So talk about how motherhood and expressing that full range of effectiveness, you might say, intrigues you.
Well, I think I've always been interested in mothers and daughters. And if you look at all five of my novels, I think it's sort of painted through. In every book, you see that that's sort of, I guess, my thing, my theme. I think it's because I'm always exploring my relationship with my own mom, and then now I have kids, and my relationship with my own daughters, my mom's relationship with her mother. I'm always sort of trying to figure out how these things work. In the House of Eve, it was really important for me to show motherhood from all different sides, because one of the things that I learned was that all mothers are always doing their very best in the moment, right? So when they make decisions in the moment, they think it's the best decision. Now, whether the child thinks that, whether the mother second guess herself, 2 weeks later and goes, I should have done it differently. In that moment, she's always doing her very best. And I wanted to show that from different sides. So even though we read Ruby's mom as the villain, I think in some ways she thinks that she's doing what's best for her daughter, which is staying away. And then we get the mothers of the boys in the story, and they are both overwhelming and, got their fingers all in the pie. But I think that they think in those moments that they're doing the very best for their family. And so I wanted to show that from different angles, from different sides, from different perspectives in the House of Eve.
So you have these two women, but they also have and the relationships with this mother-in-law and the mother, but then you also have these interesting male characters,
Mm.
Eleanor's husband and Ruby's boyfriend Shimmy. Talk about how you came upon them, because they both seem terrific characters.
Thank you. Yeah, Shimmy actually was kind of born out of my mom's history. When I asked, what was it like growing up in North Philadelphia? She's, who lived there? She said that Black people and Jewish people lived in close proximities, and they often came, in contact during goods and commerce. And so I thought, oh, if I want to spice the story up a little bit, I could sort of play with that relationship between the two groups. And so when I started that's when I started thinking about Shimmy. I had just seen the limited series Unorthodox. I think it was on
Oh
HBO.
yes, yes, I
And
saw
I
that.
was, oh my gosh, I was so touched by that story that it kind of kept living in my head. And so when I started to think about Ruby and what that would look like, I have to say that was sort of playing, and it was perfect when I realized that it was Black folks and Jewish folks that lived closely. And so I was able to kind of play a little bit with that relationship. And he just grew. He started off kind of as, this kid who, had this interest in her. And then it just sort of grew. And then with William, I would say in Eleanor's story, I could see him pretty much off the bat. Like the moment she went into the library that very first time, I could just see his back sitting at the table, hunched over his work, and I could feel her heart beating and her pulse racing at the sight of him. And then everything else just sort of came from there.
Has anybody else told you that they were struck by some similarity between the Heaven and Earth grocery store by James McBride and your book?
No, and I haven't even had a chance to read that yet.
Oh my gosh. Well, the Heaven and Earth grocery store, of course, James McBride is a very noted author.
Phenomenal. Yeah.
Is done because it's a tribute to his grandmother.
Hmm.
And his grandmother was Jewish and ran a grocery store in an all-Black neighborhood.
Hmm.
So the relationship between African Americans and the Jewish population is a big theme in his book.
Wow.
And I thought so I thought about it from that perspective, but I also thought about it from the perspective of the fact that in the epilogue or whatever that he writes about how this is really a tribute to his grandmother who didn't have a great life, and he wanted to kind of imagine a better life for her. So
Mm,
I thought the books were, I read them pretty close to each other, and I was surprised by how similar the themes were, and how both
mm.
of you nailed the time and the place, you know, that and the social dynamics. So I just didn't know if anybody had mentioned that to you. So in addition to motherhood, the book has other themes like about marital fidelity and friendship and shame and secrets. So
Mm,
talk about the shame of infertility, the shame of being an unwed mother, and the shame of adoption, how all of those
mm.
play a role in the book, this notion of shame for so many women's issues in women's lives.
Yeah. I mean, I think that shame is a running theme um, for most women, just in general. I think that there's always a lot of shame. If the mother is blamed for everything, right? If your kid goes to school and he slaps somebody, it's like, what is his mother teaching him? So we women, we mothers, we have a really tough job that, if we get it right, there's something. If we get it wrong, there's something. And so I was thinking a lot about that. I also think that we don't really make space a lot of times for women who suffer from infertility, that it's often something that they have to nurse privately. They're shameful and might not want to talk about it. It's a source of it's a source of embarrassment to some. And so I just thought that I needed to make space for those women in the story, and sort of tell their story again so that they wouldn't feel alone. But it's a running it's a running feeling, I think, that I have, that women, our story a lot of times is left out of the conversation, and there's so many secrets that we have to keep, and that you're only as sick as your secrets. And so I hope that this book sets some people free.
I was also interested in other interviews I saw that you did, that you talked about how the shame in American culture, that there's the same culture shame universal in Canada and Great Britain, and that it's not an American issue, that the shame about these vital issues to women lives is a universal concept. And how much did that drive your thinking about how you wrote the book?
Yeah, when I was researching the maternity homes specifically, I found that it wasn't just an American phenomena. Between 1945 and 1975, 1.5 million babies were born here in the United States in maternity homes. So that was just in our country. But I also found this story in Canada. I found it in Ireland. I found it in England. And so it wasn't just something that we were going through. It definitely was a universal story that was being told. Women who were being forced and to give up their babies, and a lot of reasons was because there was no IVF during that time. So there were, upper echelon, or couples that wanted to have a baby. This was really the only way to get the baby, was to have these women go into these homes and to give them up. And it wasn't just us; it was definitely across the board.
And talk about, just that made me curious as to how your international book sales have gone, given that this is not a cultural American issue, but is a universal
Mhm.
issue.
Yeah, so thank goodness, going pretty well. I think maybe in 10 countries now, maybe 7 different languages or something like that. I probably should know those facts because, this is actually my first book to go international. I think Yellow Wife was in Portuguese. And so now the House of Eve, it has started to kind of branch me out a little bit overseas, which has been good.
So you're very casual about that, but I think, I mean, did you imagine yourself saying 10 years ago, I think my book's been translated into 7 others? Which is, I mean, that is such a cool thing to be able to say.
No, it definitely is. And the truth of the matter is yes, I did imagine this. I am a very strong believer in visualization and vision boards and kind of declaring to the universe what it is that you want. And so it doesn't always happen really quickly, but I am very intentional about the things that I put out there, the things that I say, the vision that I have for my career. So I am hoping to be able to have a conversation with you, in the next couple of years and say, "Oh yeah, it's been printed in 20 languages and we've sold over 1 million copies."
Yeah,
We'll have that
yeah.
conversation the next time.
Okay, okay. Well, actually, this fits into my next question because, again, from reading other interviews you've done, I was fascinated about how extensive the research you do is about the decade that you're in and the location and what the culture was and your need to kind of touch and feel and see fabric and
Hmm.
things and
Yeah,
about how you do you called it in other interviews your picture wall, but or a vision wall. So
yeah.
talk about
Uh-huh.
I think the audience would be interested in hearing how you do that.
Well, I have started with the picture wall for my stories, and I didn't start that until was writing historical fiction. My first three novels were contemporary fiction. The character sort of lived in my head and my imagination, and it wasn't hard. But when I sat down to write Yellow Wife, I thought, well, I need to kind of world build here. I mean, this is the 1800s. I need to be able to see it. And so that was my first time cutting out pictures, and I have a wall right in front of where I keep my computer, and I started to paste pictures. So for the House of Eve, there was a picture of a maternity home. There were a few pictures out of like Ebony magazine so that I could see the fashion and the girls with the swing skirts. There was a picture of the cribs that the kids lived in these maternity homes. There was a picture of sororities. There's a sorority section in the story. So I had different pictures up on the wall. There's a librarian who's in the story named Dorothy Porter, and she was a real person. And so I cut pictures of her and articles that I found on her just so that I could kind of be surrounded by this world so that as I was creating it, I was kind of always in it. I do need to go on field trips. So the House of Magdalene that's in the House of Eve is actually based on the Florence Crittenden homes, which were all over the country, but specifically there was one in DC. So I went to visit. It's now, I think, an elementary school or a middle school, but I needed to walk the grounds and put my hand on the building and sort of imagine and visualize, well, where did the girls live and how did they deal with um, uh, separation, because this was still the 50s, right? And so there was still a lot of separation between blacks and whites during that time. So how was that handled in the house? And so I had to kind of get a feel and a sense of it, and go to Howard University and walk the library and smell the books and all of that. But I spent a lot of time poking through my mom's memories of what it was like for her growing up in North Philadelphia, and stories that maybe my grandmother had told her. Looking at people in my family who may have been born during that time. What was that like? What did you listen to? What was your favorite song? What did you eat? Where did you party? Like those types of questions I need to know, and that informs the background of the story and the writing for me.
You know, it's interesting because we had a Florence Crittenden home in the community I lived in Michigan. And
Mm.
so your description of the girls that Ruby meets in the home and their individual stories, I think it's one of the most vivid parts of the book, actually, because the way they were treated was so horrific in some ways.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think, that part of the book gives you a real sense of being there
Mm.
and being young and being scared, and you really captured that well. So I also think our viewers would be interested in knowing how long it took you to write this book, when you started it, and how long you took. And I know you said this is your quickest book, but still talk
Mhm.
about how long it took you from beginning when Ruby came to you, and then when Eleanor came to you, and until the book was published.
So the story actually lives inside of me longer than it is that I'm actually writing it. So I get the idea as I'm writing the book before. So as I was writing Yellow Wife, I started to get little glimpses of the story. And then I would just jot it down in a notebook and kind of put it to the side. I can't chase that story because I'm already working on another story. So then it's just sort of living inside of me, kind of at the back of my brain. But once I said yes to it and, I knew that I was writing this book, I would say it probably took about a year and a half, which was really quick for me. My first novel took me over 10 years to write.
I know you
And
said that.
that, yeah, that, so many times I thought, well, maybe this is not for me. Like maybe I should just go get a job at the library or a museum or something, because maybe I'm not intended to be a writer. This is a long time. But every book I got a little bit faster. I think the next book, my second novel, might have taken me 2.5 to 3 years. And so I was getting a little bit faster. So by the time I got to The House of Eve, I think it was about a year and a half altogether that it took to write this book. So I'm hoping that same magic is sort of falling over me right now as I'm working on my sixth novel, because my date to my editor is December 1st, and it feels a bit scary, but I'm like, okay, I could do this. You could do this. Just keep your butt in the chair.
And can you give us a preview? Is it a historical novel also, historical fiction?
Yeah, so my novel that I'm working on now is historical fiction. It takes place in the late 1940s. It starts in 1948. And it tells the story of there were during the occupation in Germany, there was thousands of Black troops that went over to Germany to help with the occupation. And they met or fell in love with German women. Some had children. And this book is what happens to those children.
Wow, wow. We'll really look forward to that. And
Mm-hmm.
and I just have to say, we so appreciate you spending time with us this afternoon. I would highly recommend House of Eve. It's a real page turner. And good luck in your career. And we've done 36 authors, but we've done some repeats because they've been so
Mm.
popular. So I think I'm going to be seeing you again.
Yeah, well, we gotta talk again so that I can tell you that my book has been printed in 20 different languages, right? We gotta have that conversation.
I think that's a great goal. I commend you on that goal. And you sound like your vision board works for you and makes it happen. So thank you so much, Sadequa.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Robin,
Hello,
back to
Janet.
you.
Once again, a great interview. That was so interesting, wasn't it?
Yeah, she has so many good themes in her book. This is a good book group book
Right,
discussion
okay.
because I'm thinking about our women's association and how many book groups we have, and because there are such universal themes, um, and I just seeing somebody said, were you a sociology major? You sound like a people person. And somebody just said that in the Q&A, and I'm not sure if they're referring to me or Sadiqa. But I think it would spark really interesting discussions about how women do carry shame. And speaking of that, I want to remind people that our interviews are all recorded. And
Right.
all you do when you check into the Wild Apricot website is once you register and check in, you'll see a pink banner across the top, and on the far right is a heading called recordings. I think it's either videotapes or recordings. And you can go down and watch them, and we post them within pretty much 24 hours. Nancy does a great job doing that for us. And so you can watch that. And speaking of that, I want to say that Nancy's going to get posted. We had our most highly subscribed webinar we've ever had. We had 172 registrants for
Right.
our webinar last week on what is the sale of the hospital meant. We had a great interview with Joel Taylor. And for those of you who were unable to attend that, it should, Nancy Fish is just saying it should be up shortly. That interview is available, and you can show it and watch it to your friends and have some idea of what we think the sale of the hospital means, which Joel and I and others think it means great things. I got an email today from a woman who I'm helping, whose mother is at end of life, and she said that she's in the hospital talking to all the staff, and all 100% of the staff are enthusiastic about what this sale means and
Yes.
are thrilled with the development. So
I agree. Janet heard good things about Novant coming in, and that was a wonderful, and I haven't told you, but I've talked to several people on how much they enjoyed the interview, the Zoom last week, the meeting last week, the webinar
Good.
on Thursday. I guess it was last Thursday. So we in WAHHI just want to continue to bring, great information. I know we love to network. I know we love to have fun, but I'm really a lot about education and providing opportunities for women to learn about all kinds of topics. And today's author was outstanding. Our next edition of the author series will be May the 9th, and that is Jennifer Coburn, Janet, and Cradles of the Reich is her book. And so we're excited to introduce her to everyone. And with that, happy St. Patrick's Day. I've got my green on.
You look green. Bobby and I saw Jennifer Coburn speak locally and both read her book and thought it would be terrific. So I encourage people to sign in and watch it. So great to see you again, Robin. See you next month.
You, Janet.
Or,
see you
or
next
in
month.
2
And
months.
get well.
My shiner will be gone by then.
Yeah, no more falls.
Okay.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye-bye.